There is a moment in football history that the sport itself still cannot fully explain. A man raised with nothing, from a country the world had forgotten, was voted the greatest footballer on the planet. Not by a small margin, not by sympathy, but by sheer undeniable force of will. No African player had ever stood where he stood that night, and the world watching had no frame of reference for how someone from where he came from could have arrived at that moment. To understand it, you have to go back, far back, to a place most maps barely bothered to draw. Monrovia, Liberia, 1966. A city of noise and heat and dust, where entire families shared single rooms and children grew up understanding that survival was not guaranteed. It was here, in a settlement called Gibraltar Camp, that a boy was born who would one day hold the whole continent on his shoulders. His mother Emma raised him almost alone, working every hour the sun allowed to keep her children fed. His father was largely absent, and the absence shaped everything: the hunger to prove something, the need to be seen, the fire that no amount of poverty could extinguish. Gibraltar Camp was not a place that produced footballers, it produced laborers, street vendors, and sometimes soldiers. The idea that a child from these streets could one day play in front of 80,000 people in Europe was not a dream anyone around him would have dared to say out loud. But the boy had something that poverty could not touch. He was electrifyingly fast, naturally powerful, and possessed an instinct in front of goal that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The older boys in the camp noticed it first, then the neighborhood, and eventually a man named Louis Mountimba who coached a local team called Invincible 11. Invincible 11 gave the young man his first real structure, his first proper pitch, his first sense that football could be something more than a game played between school and survival. But Liberia in the 1980s was a country beginning to fracture, and no amount of footballing talent could hold back what was coming. He was good enough that scouts from Cameroon came looking, and in his late teens he was brought to Yaoundé to train with Tonnerre Kalara Club, a team that was genuinely elite by African standards. It was a violent uprooting from everything he knew, and he arrived with almost nothing to his name. Cameroon was supposed to be a launching pad, but the path from Central Africa to Europe was not a straight line. It was a maze, and the people he trusted were not always trustworthy. Promises were made and broken, contracts were vague, and the boy from Gibraltar Camp learned early that the football world could be as brutal as the streets he had left behind. If you have ever wondered what separates the players who make it from the thousands who do not, it is rarely talent. It is the ability to keep moving when every door seems bolted shut. And those watching this story unfold are seeing exactly that quality in its rawest form. Subscribe to Football Untold and follow the channel, because stories like this one are waiting for you every week, stories football never told loudly enough. In 1988, the breakthrough finally arrived from an unexpected direction. Arsene Wenger, then managing as Monaco, received a call from a Cameroonian contact about a young Liberian striker unlike anything he had seen on the African continent. Wenger was a man who trusted instinct, and his instinct told him to move quickly. But Monaco was not yet the destination. First came a brief spell in Paris with Paris Saint-Germain, where the young striker trained and waited and fought for recognition in a city that was beautiful and cold in equal measure. He was 21 years old, sleeping in modest lodgings, calling home to Monrovia on payphones, and asking himself daily whether it was all worth it. Monaco changed everything. Under Wenger, he was not simply used as a player. He was developed as a human being, given education, structure, and an environment where his extraordinary gifts could finally breathe. Within one season, the rest of French football was asking the same question. Where did this man come from? He scored goals that defied logic, goals with his left foot, his right foot, his head, goals from angles that technically should not have been angles at all. The people who watched him play every week began to feel they were witnessing something that would not come again for a very long time. By 1992, AC Milan came calling. This was not a club that called often. They were the greatest club in the world at that moment, dripping with Brazilian legends and European trophies. The fact that they wanted a boy from the Liberian slums was, to many in the football world, frankly astonishing. Milan was a collision of worlds. Alongside players who had grown up in the most sophisticated football academies on earth, here was a man who had learned the game on red dust in West Africa. And yet from his very first season, it was clear the hierarchy at Milan had made no mistake. 1995 was the year the world stopped arguing. He won the Serie A title, the French league title, and then, in a ceremony that the entire African continent watched with disbelief and tears, he was named FIFA World Player of the Year, UEFA Best Player in Europe, and winner of the Ballon d'Or. All three, in the same year, the first African in history to do so. Back in Monrovia, in the middle of a civil war that had torn the country apart, people gathered around any radio or flickering television they could find to hear his name called. In a nation drowning in violence and grief, he had given something no weapon and no government could provide, a reason to feel proud. He used that platform the way very few footballers ever have. He funded schools. He built a stadium in Monrovia with his own money. He paid the wages of the Liberian national team out of his own pocket when the government could not afford to. He was not performing charity, he was repaying a debt he felt he owed to the streets that made him. His later years in football took him to Chelsea, to Manchester City, to Marseille. Clubs that recognized his name still carried currency long after his peak. But those who had watched him in his absolute prime knew something the highlights alone could not capture. He had played with a weight on him that most athletes never carry. He carried Liberia, a nation of millions who had no other voice in world sport, into every stadium he ever entered. When he pulled on the national team shirt, it was not about glory or personal records. It was about making his people visible in a world that preferred not to look. He tried desperately to take Liberia to a World Cup, a feat that would have been the single greatest achievement in the history of African football given the size and resources of the country. They came agonizingly close in 1996, but qualification slipped away, and he never stopped mourning that particular failure. Even in those defeats, he remained a figure of almost mythological status at home. Children who had never seen a football stadium named him as their reason for playing. Coaches across West Africa used his story as proof to parents that football was not a waste of time. He had changed the entire ecosystem of African football simply by existing at the level he existed at. Retirement, when it finally came in 2003, was not the end of the story. It was, impossibly, only the end of the first chapter. The man who had conquered football turned his attention to something even more difficult: politics. He ran for president of Liberia in 2005 and lost, but the vote he received from a battered and traumatized population was a referendum on what he represented: hope, dignity, and the idea that one of their own could reach the highest places on earth. He did not stop. He ran again in 2017, and this time Liberia said yes. A man who grew up without shoes in Gibraltar camp, who had once called home from a Paris payphone with barely a franc in his pocket, was elected president of the Republic of Liberia. The football world could barely believe what it was reading. His presidency has not been without its complications and criticisms. Governance is not football, and the problems facing Liberia are not solvable by pace and finishing alone. But the symbolism of his journey remains untouched and untouchable. No other human being in the history of sport has walked the path from a slum, to a Ballon d'Or, to a head of state. The children of Liberia today grow up knowing his name the way children in other countries know the names of kings and generals. But he is not a king by birth. He is something rarer and harder to manufacture. A man who became extraordinary in a world designed to keep people like him ordinary. Every great story in football begins somewhere unremarkable: a dusty pitch, a borrowed pair of boots, a parent working too many hours to watch the match. What makes a story extraordinary is not the destination but the distance between where it started and where it ended. From Gibraltar camp to the Ballon d'Or to the presidency of a nation. This is the story football almost forgot to tell, and it is the reason Football Untold exists. If you believe that the greatest stories in this sport are not always found in the biggest stadiums, follow this channel, because there are 100 more stories like this one waiting for you, and every single one of them deserves to be heard.